Hello, I'm Mariam Lawal, Sustainability Analyst at the Chartered Banker Institute, bringing you a brief overview of what has taken place in climate-related financial regulation since the start of October 2022 and what might be coming up soon. I hope you find this briefing useful, but if you have suggestions for improvement, do let us know. Contact details will show on the final slide. And finally, please feel free to share this update more widely via social media. Thank you. UK regulator warns financials that they face climate risk supervisory escalation. The Prudential Regulation Authority, the PRA, warns that banks and insurers face an escalation in supervisory pressure if they fail to adequately address climate-related financial risks. The warning by the PRA, which is part of the Bank of England, accompanied the assessment of how well banks and insurers had adopted its recommendations on enhancing their approaches to managing the financial risks from climate change in 2019. The PRA had proposed that it will engage in an ongoing supervisory process with the banks and insurers, however, with a warning that it may discipline those that fail to take appropriate steps to manage these risks in the future. Anti-greenwashing rules have been proposed by the UK regulator. The UK's Financial Conduct Authority, the FCA, plans to propose rules to help consumers and firms build trust in ESG-labeled products. With the recent surge in climate-friendly and sustainable products and funds, the FCA has expressed its concerns about misleading claims on products and their contributions to advancing sustainability in the real economy. Under the draft rules, sustainable investment products would be organized into one of three categories: sustainable focused products, which are those invested in assets that are environmentally and/or socially sustainable. Sustainable improvers are those that aim to bolster the sustainability of assets over time. And sustainable impact products are those that invest in solutions and environmental or social problems. An additional anti-greenwashing rule in the proposal would curb the use of ESG-related terms in the names and marketing materials of products that don't belong to one of these three sustainable investment categories. Additionally, the FCA wants distributors to clearly display sustainable investment labels on product web pages, applications, and other digital medium, and to not use these labels for products that haven't earned them. The proposal is open for public consultation until January 25, 2023. In Singapore, the United Overseas Bank (UOB) sets 2050 net zero target and rules out new oil and gas financing. The Singaporean bank has announced a 2050 net zero target across its lending portfolio and aims to achieve this by rolling out new financing for upstream oil and gas projects. It is also committed to exiting financing for the thermal coal sector by 2039. The bank has focused on 6 sectors which make up about 60% of the value of its lending portfolio by setting out decarbonization targets for power, automotive, oil and gas, real estate, construction, and steel. All targets are based on current emissions referenced against the science-based approved sectoral transition pathway. The bank pledged to report annually on its progress against the net zero targets and highlighted the importance of an ecosystem of regulators, policymakers, and the financial industry if its targets will be met. In the United States, financial regulators established Climate Risk Group. The Financial Stability Oversight Council, FSOC, a panel of federal regulators charged with monitoring the U.S. financial system, has recently announced the formation of a committee known as the Climate-Related Financial Risk Advisory Committee, which is dedicated to exploring climate threats. The committee will be charged with collecting data, running analyses, and making recommendations to identify, assess, and mitigate climate-related financial risks in support of FSOC's financial stability mandate. Also in the US, small banks could lose safety nets as climate risks grow, according to the US regulator. As the planet heats up, climate-related financial threats will grow, and banks may not be able to depend on traditional shock absorbers to recover from extreme weather events. Over-reliance on insurance and government support presents additional risks, as these may not be able to compensate for the losses to the same extent as they have in the past, or could become more expensive. While this may be challenging for mid-sized and community banks across the country, this may stress the ability for small banks to mitigate climate-related financial risks. To general topics, a carbon tracker report says that climate risks are being ignored in big emitters' financial disclosures. According to Carbon Tracker, out of 134 international firms that are jointly responsible for 80% of corporate emissions, 98% of these firms do not provide sufficient evidence that their disclosures include the impacts of climate-related matters. Many asset and liability values rely on forward-looking assumptions, and when companies do not take climate-related matters into account, their financial statements may include overstated assets, understated liabilities, and overstated profits. By neglecting climate matters in their financial statements, Carbon Tracker says companies rob investors of a full understanding of their climate risks and also hinder global decarbonization efforts. Banks lack capital to guard against stranded assets, according to a Finance Watch study. Fossil fuel assets are deemed to be stranded in the near future if the world is to deliver on its international climate commitments. However, research conducted by Finance Watch shows that the world's 60 largest banks, including global lenders such as JP Morgan, the Royal Bank of Canada, and HSBC, do not have enough capital to absorb potential losses to their fossil fuel portfolios. According to the current banking rules, banks are expected to have enough capital to cover future losses. However, the risk of fossil fuel investments becoming stranded assets are not adequately reflected. The aforementioned lenders have a combined $1.35 trillion of oil, gas, and coal investments, and banks are therefore expected to make up for the shortfall by raising between $157 billion to approximately $210 billion of extra capital, which is equivalent to 3 to 5 months of earnings, according to Finance Watch. There is also an implication for policy action to enable banks set more capital aside for fossil fuel assets. The International Sustainability Standards Board (ISSB) includes the reporting of Scope 3 emissions into climate disclosures. The ISSB says climate disclosures produced in line with its rules will have to include organizations' direct and indirect emissions, which cover Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Scope 3 emissions are the indirect emissions associated with the firm's value chain. The emissions data would have to be reported according to the GHG Protocol Corporate Standard, a global emissions accounting benchmark. The ISSB also said it would draft relief provisions such as allowing companies more time to generate Scope 3 reports and providing safe harbor rules, that guide against lawsuits from investors and other capital market participants. Mark Carney and Eric Usher speak on advancing the net zero agenda at the UNEP Global Roundtable Summit. The high-level dialogue between Mark Carney, the UN Special Envoy on Climate Action and Finance, and the UNEP head Eric Usher focused on the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero (GFANZ) members' commitment to address the climate crisis and finance the transition to a net zero economy. Mark Carney spoke on the importance of accountability, consistency, and transparency in institutions' journey to net zero, and further highlighted the upcoming Net Zero Data Public Utility, which is a free platform to help regulators, financial institutions, and data providers overcome climate gaps, which he hopes will create a positive feedback loop between key stakeholders. Finally, there was an emphasis on the role of policymakers and the industry as a whole in transitioning from voluntary to mainstream adoption of net zero finance and achieving the ultimate goal, which is financing action in the real economy. GFANZ, which is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, has published Net Zero Transition Plan guidance. The GFANZ, launched by Mark Carney in April of 2021, has just published its voluntary guidance on net zero transition plans, also known as the NZTPs. The voluntary guidance is focused on Scope 3 emissions for achieving net zero by 2050. According to the Alliance, the published guidance is designed to help institutions translate net zero commitments into strategies that aim to reduce real-world greenhouse gas emissions. The framework identified 4 strategies to facilitate real economy transitions, which include low-emitting technologies and nature-based solutions, entities already aligned with the 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario, such as those who have made progress against their SBTI-approved targets, entities that are committed to transitioning in line with the 1.5 degrees Celsius, regardless of whether they are high or low emitting, and phasing out high emitting physical assets. It further details the real measures financial institutions will have to take and the metrics and governance they will establish to turn their net zero pledges into action. And finally, Rabobank sets impacts for $100 billion loan portfolio. Rabobank has set climate and social impact targets for its food and agricultural loan portfolio, which has an estimated size of $103 billion. The bank aims to support 15 million farmers in Africa, Asia, and Latin America with direct capital from its food and agricultural loan portfolio to achieve targets for 2023, 2025, and 2030. By 2030, it aims to sequester 150 megatons of carbon dioxide annually, and farmers will sequester carbon through agroforestry, that is, growing trees and crops on the same land.